Hey everybody, so what we're going to be working on is just setting up our loom here and getting our first weave structure, plain weave, set up. So I have one of my tapestry needles, the piece of paper, and really any type of paper would do. You don't actually need this step, but it does make it easier later. And I am going to be working with my first color. Okay, so I'll set those things aside until I need them. First thing that I'm going to do is start with my paper. So we have already warped your loom, so you don't have to worry about that, but if you haven't warped your loom, really it's super easy. It's just taking the string and going through the little slots at the top, down and around and around and around. So first step here is going to be plain weave with paper. This is just going to give us a little barrier from the bottom. So what I'm going to do is go underneath my first warp and over my second. All of these vertical strands are called warps. Whatever loom you're using, it's going to be the same term. They're always going to be warps. So under the first, over the second, under the third, over the fourth. So you're just doing an under-over pattern for this whole thing. So I'm skipping each other warp, every other warp, to put this paper in. So it's almost like I'm pushing one down and then I'm lifting one up, and then I'm pushing one down and I'm lifting one up. And this piece of paper will act as a barrier to the bottom. Gives us our first row. I'm going to tuck this all the way down. Some of you might have tape down here. If you do, that's awesome. If you don't, it's not a big deal. Don't stress about it. I don't have tape on the bottom of mine, so it's pretty much okay. So now what I'm going to do is just pull some string off of my skein of yarn here. This is a skein, okay? But I'm also going to just measure this out. So if you put your arms all the way out next to you, so like one arm out, the other arm out, at shoulder height, that's called a wingspan. We want 2 wingspans of each yarn at least. Don't do anything shorter than that unless we're working with a very small section. And then you're just going to cut it at the end. So make sure that you have a pair of scissors near you. If your scissors aren't great, the best thing to do is kind of fold your yarn over the scissors and then snip down. It'll work easier than if you're just trying to cut it like that. My scissors are pretty good, so I don't have to worry about that too much. Alright, so we're going to thread our needle. Some people like to tie the string on, which is fine if you do. Just do one loop, a 1-loop knot, so it's easy to get apart. If you have more than 1 loop, then it's a little more difficult to get apart. Just keep an eye on that knot so it doesn't come undone. Alright, so the next thing that we're going to do is start our plain weave. So we are going to work opposite from how we put this paper in. A lot of people will start over here at the end, but I think that's more difficult to finish your weaving later. So we're going to start in the middle. And we're going to pick one of the warps that are underneath the paper here. So this warp goes underneath the paper. These 2 warps on either side go over the paper. We want one that goes under. We're going to go under that one. So we're going underneath, over, under, over, under, over. And this is opposite of how that paper was put in. If it's easier for you to pick these warps up with your fingers, that's fine. Or you can take your needle and kind of do a zigzag up and down motion. So you're going to pull your needle all the way through. Make sure not to hurt anyone with your needle, so sometimes I like to set it aside so I don't have to worry about it. We're going to pull this all the way through until we have about 4 to 6 inches left of our string. Then we're going to tuck it down with our fingers. If you have a wide tooth comb at home, that works too. So now this string we just let hang, and that's fine. Now we're going to do plain weave all the way across. So this warp at the very end, if you look closely, you'll see that my weft, that's the strings that go across. Warp goes up and down. Weft goes left to right, left to right. So it goes across. My weft goes underneath my last warp. So my weft now has to go over the last warp. My weft goes over my second warp. So it has to go under my second warp. Basically, it's the opposite of the row below, always in plain weave. So here we're going to go over this one, under the next, over, under, over, under, over, under, over, under, all the way across. Now once you get to the center, you'll see that, oh, this is a little different because we're actually following the same weave structure as the paper, but that's okay. It'll work itself out in the end, so don't stress about it. Again, drop your needle so that you're not pulling on the needle and hurting anyone around you. These needles can sometimes break, and if they do, just let me know. And you can use a piece of tape at the end of your yarn. You could actually just do this with your fingers. So we're going to pull this down. Really, any needle with a large eye would do. So if you would have something at home that would be similar to this, then you could use it. All right, so now we have done our second row, and we're going to do a third row. So we have our yarn underneath this last warp and over the second. So we need to go over this first warp. So remember, it's always opposite. Over the first warp and under the second. So over, under, over, under, over, under, over, under. Some issues that you might find is if your warp is pretty tight, it might be difficult to get this through, but that's okay. You just have to kind of go with it. A tighter warp is actually a nicer thing because then it'll keep your weave structure nice and neat. Now, when you pull on this the last time, don't pull too hard. You don't want to pull your warp string in. Do you see how that went in? And there's now less space between my warps. You want to keep the same amount of space between your warps all the time. But you also don't want to have, let me pull this out a little bit. You also don't want to have a big loop on the end because that is just going to be unsightly. So what I like to do is have my loop just loosely wrapped around the end so it's hugging that last warp, and then all of my weft strings go up on an angle, and then I push them down with my fingers from where the loop is to where my end is. And as you're pushing it down, you'll notice that you're losing your warp strands. That's okay. That's natural. That's supposed to happen. All right, so I'm going to make my fourth plain weave row. It makes it a little bit easier because the strings that I have to go under are actually pushed up from my row below. Again, setting my needle aside so that I don't hurt anyone with the needle. It's a good thing that these are plastic needles. You don't have to worry about these kind of being too dangerous. Okay, on an upward angle, making sure my loop here on the end stays nice and neat, and then pushing it down with my fingers. And again, if you have a wide tooth comb at home, you could use a wide tooth comb. Now this way it's a little bit trickier because my warps are opposite. So I'm picking up and going down each one. If you find that you have made a mistake and you've gone over 2 warps like I have here, all you have to do is just weave backwards. It's not tricky. It's just the opposite of what you did. You're just pushing your needle through to kind of unweave. So if I needed to unweave, let's say I made a mistake in here, I'd be like, oh, I need to fix this. I would just follow how my string went through the warps until I got to my mistake, and then I could pull my needle out, be like, oh, yay, now I can fix it. So I was underneath this one, so I go over, under, over, under, over, under, over, under, all the way through. Now my string came out of my needle. That's okay, not a big deal. I can just put it back in. Pull it all the way through. Nice loose warp at the end. Push it down. And there we go. Now, as you're going through, you'll want to make sure that you have a good amount of plain weave. So I would say probably about 1 inch or the width of your 2 fingers. Give that a try. And when you're finished with this, always end in the center. Doesn't have to be exactly where you were before. So by center, I mean always end somewhere like in this area. You don't want to end having your strings hang off the side, and you don't want to end too close to the edge because that's going to be difficult to weave in later. So let's say this would be my end. I would just take my scissors and I'd cut this and I would be done with plain weave. But I want you to try to do about an inch because then you'll see that you can create this with a good technique. All right, that's it for plain weave. Keep an eye on other posts so that you can see new videos.